This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Core Brain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome aboard, folks. Dr. Charles Parker here, and we're here for another episode of Core Brain Journal. And I'm going to tell you, you can't see this, folks, right now, but my socks are rolling up and down. This is going to be a very interesting meeting. And we have with us Dr. Brian Andy Farah, who is with us from North Carolina. I'm going to do a full introduction in a second. We're going to be talking about Hemingway's brain, folks, and even if you're only remotely interested in Hemingway, if you think he's, some kind of distorted individual with bipolar illness or whatever, you're going to have your chimes rung on this talk, because this gentleman, Dr. Farah, I've read the initial part of his book on Hemingway's brain out at Amazon. You can take a look at it yourself. It's a serious piece of writing, and I'm really looking forward to talking to him. So the word from our sponsors is twofold. First of all, I wanted to mention that you CBJ listeners already know how much we appreciate detailed improvements of mind care. And today we're pleased to welcome a new sponsor and partner with a deep interest in fresh options to address the complexity of adolescent treatment failure nationally and internationally. For 80 years, the nonprofit Barry Robinson Center down here in beautiful downtown Norfolk, Virginia, provides residential care on an evolved family, interpersonal level. More about them in just a minute. And our other sponsor, regarding the business of our attention to reality and data, you know how much we love laboratory data. And we love the reality. So today we're welcoming an additional clinical friend and new sponsor partner, Direct Health Access Laboratory, right outside of Chicago. And remember this about their labs, which we'll tell you more about in a minute. If they can serve professionals in Nigeria, they can certainly help you out in Fargo. Yeah, stay tuned. Okay, so let me introduce Andy Farah and say a couple words about him. He is the Chief of Psychiatry, the Medical Director at High Point Regional Health System in UNC Healthcare, Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He's a board-certified psychiatrist, co-investigator, the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, groundbreaking study. Get this, folks, because we're going to have another meeting to talk to Andy about this, because he is a mix of being a literary guy who's really a very interesting reporter on the biography of Ernest Hemingway, but he's also written a very interesting study on the correlation of clinical response with homocysteine reduction during therapy with reduced B vitamins in patients with major depressive disorder who have some genetic polymorphisms. I won't go into the details. So that is going to be another interesting one that we're going to talk about. So for right now, we're going to talk about Ernest Hemingway. We're going to talk about every aspect. And I'm going to say on a personal note, even before we get started, Andy, some of our audience know this already, but I've been interested in Ernest Hemingway for a long time. I don't know what grabbed you. I'm looking forward to hearing what grabbed you about Hemingway and his medical illness, his psychiatric illness. But for me, it was the same thing. I liked the guy. I liked his writing. We talked earlier several weeks ago about how we enjoyed Farewell to Arms and how it was transformational for us. And then to see what happened to him in his lifetime and to really read about his history, it's really phenomenal. So with that brief intro, Andy, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you started on the Hemingway path and how all that began for you.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Barr. It's a lovely introduction, and thank you for having, Core Brain Journal. I mean, it's just such a great service to clinicians, to patients, and families. So congratulations to you. And
thank you.
Yeah, this is really, I'm so glad you're a fan, and it's so exciting to get this notice. You work on these things for years in silence, and you don't know how it's coming out or how people are going to accept it. But you're absolutely right. Years ago, I had just gotten out of, I shouldn't say years ago, I got out of residency in the late 90s, right? And there was a wonderful gentleman named Bill Smallwood. He was one of the Hemingway biographers, but his emphasis was the last 10 years of Hemingway's life. And, of course, in Idaho, he co-wrote the Idaho Hemingway. And, of course, he wanted to know, he sought me out. I had done research on shock therapy, ECT, and he wanted to meet someone who knew about ECT, and he had two questions. One was, why did Hemingway decline and not improve with his ECT? Because he had read that 90% of people get a cure once they get their shock therapy. And the second question was, what would you do for him today? And so we had a lovely dinner, lovely man, and I said, the patients that we do ECT with who decline rather than improve, what that usually indicates is they have some form of organic brain disease, and it was yet to be diagnosed, but the ECT was that biological stressor that sort of propelled it, or at least brought it out, sort of like when grandmother goes in the hospital with a hip fracture, and suddenly now her dementia shows up, and the family says, well, she didn't have dementia before she came in, why do you say she has Alzheimer's now? And you have to explain, well, the hip fracture, the anesthesia, the medical stress was a biological stressor on the system that now she's ripped out of her environment, and now the dementia is manifest. And so he said, well, what would that, biological stressor have been for, that underlying organic disease for which the biological stressor was ECT? What was that organic, illness for Hemingway? And I said, well, I don't know. Let me read your book. And it was fascinating. I read all the biographies I could. I started reading the memoirs and the letters. And frankly, shortly into that endeavor, I put the pieces together, and I was really surprised that no one else had. It just seemed to me very, very obvious what was going on with this gentleman and this genius, actually, this man who redefined modernism and pretty much shaped literary history of the 20th century. It was very obvious to me, what had happened. Here's a man who suffered 9 major concussions in his life, both blast-type injuries and direct blows to his head, and who had untreated diabetes and hypertension for most of his adult life. So we have an individual that by the time he received his shock therapy, then for psychosis, for depression, sure, but he had a form of dementia. Predominantly, it was chronic traumatic encephalopathy, just like, our football players have today. Mm-hmm. But there was probably a vascular component. There was probably an alcoholic component. But the ECT was that biological stressor on that system that he could not handle either from a psychological standpoint, because, of course, the memory deficits were accentuated and he felt he could not work, or from a physiological standpoint, and it sort of propelled that dementia. So that's how I got interested. And of course, like you, I was a fan of the, of the fictional works. And I always remember when I was in high school reading, I think, 10 Indians, where there was this lovely line where the little boy Nick has learned that his girlfriend, has been sort of off with somebody else, right? So he wakes up the next morning, and there's this lovely line where it says he was awake a long time before he remembered that his heart was broken. And you think, that's a beautiful line, being this, like 12-year-old, 13-year-old boy, and you remember what it was like to decide what your emotions would be and have your little heart broken. And I think that for me, I think Hemingway's sensitivity and his genius in that, in that observation, that awareness. I mean, he's even been compared to Proust in that sense, that articulation and perception. But people get confused by the persona. Mm-hmm. And the persona kind of distracts from the incredible sensitivity of the genius, So again, it was that lovely combination of my two passions, the literature and the psychiatric demise, that propelled me to just pursue this work. Yeah.
Well, I didn't realize that he had 9 Very concussions. Fun. I had some number in my mind because I'd done a very superficial level of studying, because I knew that the electroshock had been damaging to him, and I had been talking about, I did a presentation probably several years ago, like 10 years ago, saying, if we're missing the fact that electroshock does this to a person who's already brain damaged, and I think I came up with about 4 concussions. The airplane accident in Africa, the running on the Jeep outside of Paris after the Germans were out, and then you filled me in. There were a couple of others, and then you filled me in. Boom, boom, boom. You have a number of them. on your mind because you did such careful work. Since we're on the subject of brain injury itself, and since it's such an absolutely relevant, Andy, you may not know this, but we've got a whole page on Core Brain Journal just for vets because we're so interested in what happens with, and of course, he was a vet. He was a guy coming back from the war who had a number of incidents occur. And anyway, if you would tell us a little bit about that, because brain injury is something we're all interested in here.
You're right. It's very, very timely. And you're right. You name, most people knew Hemingway had injuries, but you're absolutely right as far as the exact number. We know he boxed as a youth, boxed throughout most of his adult life. We know he played high school in football. And in fact, in The Sun Also Rises, he talks about, being knocked out by the boxer Cohen, and he describes it being like when he was at a football game and being kicked in the head early in the game and everything was far off, and he would take steps and they sounded like they were coming from far off. So he had no problem describing post-concussive syndrome in literature or in letters. I kind of went through his selected letters and the 3 volumes of the collected letters and just put like little sticky notes in the margins every time I saw him mention post-concussive symptoms or name the word concussion in his letters. It's like 7 notes, and I haven't even gotten through the end of the book. But you're absolutely right. The first we know that concussive injury, whether it's a blast wave injury from an explosion or a direct blow, we know we have the diffuse axonal injury. So we have the axon shearing, tearing, ripping, breaking, leading to, of course, an inflammatory response, cytokines release, intracellular contents released, and the damage that occurs will obviously happen weeks later, months later, years later. In fact, to go from post-concussive syndrome to chronic traumatic encephalopathy takes about 10 years, right? So people can have a concussion and 10 years later have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But the important thing, you're right, the blast injury in World War I for Hemingway was critical because this he's on the Austrian front. A 5-gallon mortar explodes, kills 2 men between him and the bomb, and it throws him several feet, knocks him unconscious. So we have this blast wave injury. And what's important about that concussion, he's a young man, and that bodes well. People who are younger do better. But we know that 20% of veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan do have post-concussive symptoms from blast wave, the IUDs. This is a blast wave injury, not a direct blow injury. But that was the first concussive injury for Hemingway. So we might still be having this discussion, even if that were the only one that he suffered. But of course, he roused himself. So the legend goes. He carried another wounded man, covered himself in blood with that man's wounds. Of course, he gets to he passes out. He's hit with machine gun bullets. So he has multiple injuries. By the time he gets to the dugout, a Florentine priest administers first rites because he thinks he's dead. But the bottom line is that was his first concussive injury in World War I. By World War II, actually, a lot happened in between. In the Paris years, 1928, he's gone out drinking with his buddy Archie McLeish, and they come in at 2 in the morning, and Hemingway goes to the restroom. Instead of pulling the cord for the commode, he mixes it up with a cord for the skylight, and it's already been broken. Anyway, he pulls a skylight out of the ceiling from 12 feet high and knocks himself in the head and gives himself another concussion. And of course, that the taste of blood, the giddy ramblings, all that stuff I describe in the book, he winds up writing Farewell to Arms, right after that. And
he wrote
right?
To his, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was sort of rekindled the memories from World War I. And he wrote to his editor that his wife is going to see that she makes sure he bleeds as often as he can write because it's been going so well, So that's concussion number 2. Now we zoom ahead, and now we're in London at the time of the Blitz, and everything is blacked out. And he's out partying with Robert Capa at his apartment at Leicester Square, gets in a car with another gentleman who was intoxicated. They're both intoxicated, but they chose the driver. They said, well, you're no drunker than me, you get to drive. Imagine saying that. Well, you're no drunker than Hemingway, you get to drive. And so they plow into a water tower because everything was blacked out and they couldn't turn their headlights on, so his head goes into the windshield. His Cuban doctor after that said, I think you had all the symptoms of a subdural hematoma. Who knows? We had no MRIs then or CT scans then, but he clearly had another concussion, 57 stitches across across the frontal area again. Now he's got a concussion talking about, the D-Day landings. He was too valuable an asset to be there with the first wave, but he was able to get in the Higgins boats and see the latter waves. But he talked about how hard it was to climb in and out of the riggings and in and out of the boats with the headache and the dizziness and the disequilibrium that goes with concussion. So, at any rate, He's in France now, and you're absolutely right. There's this incident where he and Robert Kopp are on an ill-advised mission. He's in the sidecar of a motorbike. A German anti-tank, they come around a corner, and they don't see the Germans, of course, until it's too late. An anti-tank round blows Hemingway out of the sidecar, and he hits his head on a boulder. So in that concussive injury, he's not only had a blast injury, but he has the direct blow injury. So he's got 2 in 1 there. And then you reference, this is very clever of you to reference his letter for Collier's when he was a reporter. He's talking about going in to liberate France, and he's in a German 88 round. This is an anti-aircraft round, blows him out of a Jeep. So he says, now we don't know. He says he hit the deck, the Jeep's locked bumpers. Nobody else could verify this. It could be a Hemingway tall tale. So we know there's at least 2 concussive injuries there after that car wreck in London, maybe a third. So now we zoom ahead in Cuba. He falls on his fishing boat. Another car accident in Cuba. He goes into the windshield, and of course, to seal the deal, we have those 2 plane crashes in Africa in 1954. Mary Hemingway's wanting to photograph the Murchison Falls. They're in a plane, and there's a flock of ibis that dives in front of the plane, so the pilot has to swerve. He hits some telegraph wires, and they crash. Now, this wasn't such a bad crash, but they're out in the open. They have to spend the night in the open. Anyway, the bottom line is a bunch of elephants are kind of curious, and because Hemingway snores through the night, and they want to trample on over and see what's going on, and Mary has to keep waking him up to stop the snoring so the elephants go away. Anyway, the next morning, another plane has spotted them, a twin-engine de Havilland. It does pick them up. It's going to take them to safety, they think. They climb into this plane, but unfortunately, the runway, it's not really a runway. It's a field that's badly plowed, and so the pilot of this plane, he crashes on takeoff. So this is a more violent and fiery crash. The cockpit is filling with smoke. The pilot kicks out the front windows, Roy Marsh, or Cartwright's the second pilot. He pulls Mary out. Hemingway's too big to get out the front windows, so the door is jammed. He's injured his shoulder from the first crash, so he very unwisely busts open the door with his head. He gives himself a basal or skull fracture and another concussion. So it was after that second plane crash that his friends really noticed that his cognition was different. His memory was deteriorating. His speech was different. His handwriting was different. So at that point, it's very clear that there was some chronic traumatic encephalopathy taking hold. In addition, of course, to chronic drinking and the untreated diabetes and hypertension. So a man in his mid-50s had these multiple concussive blows. And, the importance, I think, I emphasize in the book there, the blast wave injuries, which are certainly significant, and the boxing and such. I mean, those are chronic sub-threshold. They're not subconcussive blows, but an accumulation of them can have the same effect. So I believe that you see the effects of this in the writing. I think you see it in the personality. I was asked by Linda Miller, a famous Hemingway scholar. She said, "What impact did these concussions have on the persona?" And I said, come to think of it, if you read the biographies, the concussive injuries seem to solidify the very worst aspects of the persona. Mm-hmm. We have patients who have concussive injury, and they have post-concussive syndrome, CTE, and so forth. They get irritable, aggressive, volatile, poor judgment. Well, that was Hemingway in his last decade. So it seemed that when people say, well, he was trapped in the persona, he was behaving the way people expected him to behave, I think he was incapable organically of breaking out of that mode. I think it was just sort of, at that point, it was an organically derived pathology.
It was kind of a post-concussive depersonalization. I mean,
right. Yeah, I think
wasn't his real self. He was, and then you wrote so well in the introduction about his grandiosity, his trying to live within the persona that he had created, which was in a certain respect trying to find the reality of himself again, based on the fact that he was so disconnected with himself.
Right, you stated beautifully in the word depersonalization, because one author described it as a spy who'd been out too long and sort of believed his own cover, and that's a good psychological explanation. But I think we have, like you say so well, an organic explanation for this depersonalization and this acting out the role. Well, it's kind of what he was doing organically: mood swings, volatility, irritability, violence with Mary, and people said, well, that's just him. And it's, well, what they miss is that as a young man, we're talking about a very exquisitely sensitive, observant man, who was not at all the boisterous sort of persona that we see in the older age.
Well, the other thing that occurs to me is the whole business, and you said it so well, about the misidentification of him by saying that he was bipolar. And you said it so very well in the introduction. I didn't remember it enough to quote you, but I thought you said it very well, because I think it's something we all struggle with, those who are attempting to move the science forward and thinking about the innovations that have taken place with the advancement of technology and the real full understanding of these real biologic entities that occur that cause behavioral changes. And you said it so well. It's just that, hey, they just, I don't remember exactly what you said. Maybe you recall it. It wasn't that they were ignorant. It's that they were still living in the darkness.
Right. It wasn't medical, mismanagement. It was just misunderstanding. In fact, in 1961, when Hemingway himself was presenting to Mayo Clinic with classic chronic traumatic encephalopathy, there was it was a very important article in British Journal of Psychiatry. It was called Accident Neuroses. It said all these patients who have these car accidents, this is days before seatbelts, of course, and no seatbelts, no airbags, and these people were having concussions. And this famous psychiatrist said, look, if these patients have car accidents and they come in with all these weird symptoms like disequilibrium and mood swings and memory deficit, it's called accident neuroses. They're just looking for attention. They're looking for money. It's a form of psychogenic illness. And what's ironic about that is Hemingway himself described dementia pugilistica in The Boxer of Ad Francis, who is a kind of a conglomerate. There was a boxer named Ad Woolgast, another one named Oscar Battling Nelson, and these are early 20th century boxers who were just well known for their ability to take punishment, and unfortunately they developed chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which was called dementia pugilistica. So he wrote about that as a very young man. He wrote The Battler. Actually, he wrote that story to kind of replace the very unpublishable story Up in Michigan, which is a story of a date rape, of course. But he understood CTE, and he actually developed it. It was very prescient and very strange. Of course, he didn't know what he was writing at the time. So even though he was ahead of medical science, it's not the first time. He had these lovely characters, right? Brett Ashley, Margot McComber, and Catherine Bourne are three of his most famous female characters. And the myth is that Hemingway didn't understand women or didn't write about women. So he wrote beautifully about women as long as they had borderline personality disorder. And those are classic. If you look at Brett Ashley, Margot McComber, and Catherine Bourne, they are textbook examples of borderline personalities, which make for great literature, because they're volatile and they're hypersexual and they're whatever they are. But the bottom line is, here he was predicting another psychiatric illness before we would codify it in 1980 in DSM. So he really was a very brilliant and sensitive guy. But you're absolutely right that at the time he presented with his symptoms, nobody really had the awareness to know, if the guy comes in 1960, 1961 with delusional beliefs and depression and suicidal, well, you give him shock therapy. You think he's psychotic depression. You don't dig deeper, and that was probably the only explanation they needed. Again, he got standard of care, state-of-the-art therapy just for the wrong illness, not for the right illness.
Well, that was still the standard of care, and you know more about electroencephalography, ECT than I do, electroconvulsive therapy. But when I was a kid in my first year of residency in 1969, that was still the standard of care. I was working in a state hospital outside of Philadelphia.
Right.
And, it's just what we did. And I was on the acute ward, and the people there were very effective at helping people who were very acutely disturbed, psychotic, even paranoid. put them in and give them ECT, and would turn them around temporarily. I mean, who knew at that time what was causing those symptoms? Because the idea of having some kind of biologic appreciation of what could be going on in the person's mind was very far. I mean, those were the days of psychoanalysis, when psychoanalysis was in its heyday.
Right, and ECT worked. I mean, it generally, if you have depression or psychosis, it broke catatonia, it broke mania, broke psychosis. In fact, Hemingway's son Gregory had more shock therapy than Hemingway did, and his son Patrick had it as well. So it was standard of care. I think the movies have sort of made it very unpalatable, right? Because you have in Cuckoo's Nest, most people remember that ECT was a punitive measure, and they conflated it with frontal lobotomies, which were not. That wasn't us, right? That wasn't psychiatrists. That was neurology, a neurology guy propagating that. And then you have The Beautiful Mind, where they conflated sort of insulin coma with ECT. And in fact, yes, 20% of people who did get insulin coma therapy had seizures, and therefore it had kind of the therapeutic effect of ECT. So that's why it stuck around, even though without the seizure, it wasn't therapeutic. And I always tell people, Hemingway did not have the monopoly on mental illness when it comes to the lost generation. We have Ezra Pound, who spent his life as an untreated bipolar. We have T.S. Eliot, who was so neurotic that he couldn't pass an army physical due to anxiety, but he married a schizophrenic. Well, at least she's believed to be schizophrenic, but I think in the early 20th century, if you were a histrionic young lady, they gave you bromide and you would hallucinate, right? It's just like Evelyn Waugh had. We know Zelda Fitzgerald was schizoaffective, probably. We know Scott Fitzgerald was an alcoholic. And in this famous letter, Scott said, people think she's crazy because I drink, and they think I drink because she's crazy. And so he would just have this reciprocal, and he was so in denial. He said, well, her hallucinations are wonderful to me. And, it's just, are you kidding? This is a very tortured life. James Joyce had a daughter who was schizophrenic, and it tormented him. She even had Carl Jung as a therapist, but of course talk therapy doesn't help much with schizophrenia. So that's what's fascinating to me when I got into this, was that the lost generation itself had lots of psychopathology. I'm not much into the whole, I'm more the Paris group, not the Bloomsbury group, but of course the Virginia Woolf has been extensively studied in that group as well. So, but you're right.
You mentioned Ezra Pound. I mean, I was totally fascinated with Ezra Pound for a long period of time. The Peas and Cantos were a big transformational story for me. The guy in the cage out there. When the hoarfrost grips thy tent, thou wilt know when the night is spent.
Yes,
something.
It's an amazing story, isn't it? Because Ezra Pound, of course, is an American original. He's clearly a genius, and he's sort of the Manet to the Impressionists. Like he was sort of that role to the Lost Generation. A little older, more experienced. He got Ulysses published. He got The Wasteland published. He mentored Hemingway. So here's the grandfather of the Lost Generation. Now, what we know about him is the political problems, that he was an anti-Semite, he was anti-American. So then in the 1940s, he says, late 1930s, he says, well, I'm a fascist, I support Mussolini. Now, who in the world, would do that? And the only thing that explains it, if you read his biographies, it's so clear to me that he clearly had sort of this, he's one of those bipolar patients that spent his life in 5% of bipolars spend their life in a hypomanic episode. And then bouts of mania, fine, and maybe not so much depression, but their baseline is hypomania. And if you look at his production, nonfiction, fiction, so forth. But you also look at the loose associations and so forth. But the problem is he's a genius, so he can write this elegant stuff, and people are kind of thinking, well, he's just eccentric. So you have this elegant production in the face of this hypomania and bouts of mania. So, of course, by the time, the Allies are in control of Italy, he gets arrested for treason. He's put in Pisa, the DTC, the disciplinary training camp, which, of course, is where the military military houses. Most were calcium rapists, murderers, the worst criminals, and they had even death cells, or basically concrete bunkers in the ground that you drop somebody in, and 2 weeks later you pull up their corpse. But Pound was put in basically a dog kennel, a 10 by 10 foot dog kennel with a sloped roof. He was exposed to the elements. He was already hypomanic, quasi-psychotic, and of course this continual. He had a heat stroke. He developed psychosis. They caged him basically for a month, and then he finally goes to the medical area, and he's able to, at this point, recover and writes the piece in cantos. And it's a beautiful study. I mean, the piece in cantos, like you say, they're beautiful. They're amazing. But you put this brain, this genius brain, in this crucible of torment, not only from the elements, but from his own illness and his own delusion. And what comes out the other end when he finally recovers are this elegant piece in cantos. And it's, like I said, I've read those dozens of times like you. They're just amazing. But I think the lesson is we have this gentleman who spends 12 years in St. Elizabeth's, right? And they still don't give him lithium, or later in his life he got some amitriptyline, but nothing really therapeutic. And so they were always missing the mark with this poor guy. So the other interesting thing about Pound studies is that you have these incredible, you have Pei Yuma, you have these journals dedicated to every little tangent he went on. These are tangents of a bipolar mind, but so that every little thing he said, every mythological allusion, well, it was just a loose association. It doesn't mean you go down that rabbit hole or this rabbit hole. But at any rate, yeah, Pound was an amazing, amazing character. And if you talk about mental illness and the lost generation, I mean, he kind of trumps Hemingway as far as the pathology goes. Hemingway himself, said that Pound, he deserves sympathy, and we need to, he's very sick, and he saw his mind warping and twisting. In fact, there's the famous story where Joyce had him over for dinner, and he wanted Hemingway to come. He says, he was wacky. We just didn't know what he would do. So he wanted Hemingway to come to kind of keep an eye on Pound. But yet what shines through is this incredible literature. And of course, now I think that what's lost on people want to conflate, bipolar with creativity. Well, sure. I mean, if you're hypomanic and you're reasonably sane, you can produce. But I think that the vast majority of people who are sick to that degree, they just, to sit down and write like a Hemingway or a Pound, you can't do that when you're ill. I think Robert Lowell is a classic example of a poet who had classic bipolar illness. But when he was acutely manic, I mean, he's standing in the traffic in New York trying to stop the traffic thinking he's the Holy Ghost. So he can't, but that's not conducive to writing great poetry. It's only after, when he recovers, that he uses those experiences. And same thing with Hemingway, as his brain demented, the tool he needed to create these incredible works was simply deteriorating. I think I used the example in one of my lectures of hills like white elephants. Those four beautiful words, we all know what it means. We may have written essays about it. But, that was 83 words, 4 paragraphs, and he distilled, and that's just writing poetry, so that you can take those, that incredible, concept and just distill it down to this phrase that we all know what it means. And even now we debate, there's beautiful literature about, well, did she have the abortion or did she choose her man and keep the baby, with that wonderful phrase, hills like white elephants. And so to do that kind of brain work, it takes cognition, and that's what was suffering. And I think you alluded early on in our discussion how no one could really imitate Hemingway like Hemingway, and the works did suffer later on because of that dementia. But thank goodness, thank you for mentioning Ezra Pound. He's one of my favorites as well, from a literary and psychiatric standpoint. Yeah.
It's really interesting. One of the things as we were talking, and I just happened to notice the time, so I'm going to take a quick break here to have a moment for our sponsors to weigh in and say a little bit about them for a minute. And then we'll come right back. I've got a question for you, Andy, about transcendence and brain injury. We'll talk about that in just a second. So we'll be right back. Well, folks, you know as well as I do that psychiatric treatment failure, especially after multiple medication trials and those very, very brief hospitalizations, may prove insufficient to deal at home with the complexity of troubled children and those adolescents from 6 to 17 years old. Improved care, those next mandatory steps, should include a more comprehensive approach to address those multiple levels of challenges, from family to peers to school, diagnostically from defiance to depression, on every level for families, including military families internationally. The Barry Robinson Center's 32-acre open college-like campus in Norfolk, Virginia, provides safety and security and clean, comfortable living. How do we know? We refer folks over there all the time, strongly endorse what they're doing. So for further information, an informed interview, connect at this page, barryrobinson.org/core. Well, you folks already know that here at Core Brain Journal, we're on a mission to introduce you to resources that make significant contributions to the investigation of those predictable mind science applications. Our colleagues at DHA Lab Group provide a real difference with treatment options for people at every level, from first awareness of mind problems to those frustrating times when even well-informed treatment becomes surprisingly unpredictable. For my entire professional life, from psychoanalysis to brain scans, I've searched for, yes, improved predictability. The good news for all of us, from professionals to patients, remarkably effective research offers useful, cost-effective, organic options far beyond guesswork with psychiatric medications alone. DHA lab tests measure unbalanced biomedical details through easily available testing, now available globally for a variety of molecular answers from, for example, methylation, copper, and cryptopyrrole challenges. Check in for more details at dhalab.com core. That's dhalab.com/core. So, okay, we're back, folks, and we'll just get right on it. I want to tell you, Andy, this is a great conversation. I can't tell you how much I enjoy speaking with you. And I am going to absolutely love your book because I love the way you write. I love the way you talk, the references that you're bringing up. You're so interestingly well educated in terms of the things that have been fascinating for me, interesting for me, for my entire lifetime. So this is a real value and a real pleasure for me.
You're so kind, and like I say, when you fell in love, I fell in love with modernism when I was in high school. When I was assigned Farewell to Arms, and I remember, no, it was actually For Whom the Bell Tolls. That was the first one, and I remember going to my dad because I just said, "Dad, you got to tell me what's this Spanish Civil War? I don't understand. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys?" I remember my dad, who was a World War II veteran, he had no answer, and I'm like, this is the first time this man has no answer, and it's sort of like now when my little boy comes to me and says, "Hey, what's going on in Syria?" I'm like, gosh, I can't explain it. Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? I don't know. But I remember putting, that became a passion. Then I just said, I got to figure this stuff out. This is good work.
I think it does invite a person living life on any level to really think about the meaning of conflict and ways to transcend it. I mean, conflict is so ubiquitous. I mean, arguments with people you love, all the way to World War. I mean, all of it, we search for solutions to it and ways to actually transcend it. And while we were speaking about poetry, the question I wanted to ask you, which is obviously not prepared at all, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about it.
Sure.
One of the things that occurs to me that I was thinking about with Ezra Pound and with Hemingway and the brain injuries and the illnesses they had was when they were sick, when they were in that serious level of confusion and emotional pain, that they were seeking with their brains. The brain was a tool to try to put something together. And it has a certain measure of painful transcendence that takes you out of the ordinary, because the ordinary doesn't have any answers. Just as you were saying on your story with your father and the Middle East. I mean, there's the ordinary has no answers. The answer has to be in some other dimension that perhaps we can't appreciate because of our limited view of our lives and our time on this earth.
Yes, you nailed it. You absolutely nailed it. It's uncanny you bring that up, because when people asked Hemingway, do you see a therapist? He'd say, well, my typewriter is my therapist. And what he meant by that was that the act of working, the act of typing out a manuscript and an idea was his therapy. And he would admonish, F. Scott Fitzgerald, why are you belly aching? You need to get to work. Work is your therapy, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But what we know now is that that the process of writing Farewell to Arms, writing Sun Also Rises, writing what he wrote. In fact, take the example of My Old Man, the story he wrote, My Old Man. This is right after his father's suicide, and right after the suicide of his first girlfriend, Prudy Bolton, the little Indian girl he used to hang out with and was a little honey with as a teenager in the Michigan woods. So they both committed suicide. Prudy Bolton at age 16 when she got pregnant by an older man, and his father, of course, shot himself with a Colt pistol carried by his father in the Civil War. And so Hemingway's writing My Old Man is the most Joycean story. He has this stream of consciousness, reminiscing, and very overt sexual content. And so he's processing it. And I think that's the amazing thing about Hemingway scholarship now, is we're also used to looking backwards and saying, aha, this is an incident where, it reflects something that's happening in his life. It comes out in his fiction. Now look, going forward, he has done the therapy. He's done the work of processing, this through the fiction. Now look how it informs his life, going forward. So you're absolutely right as far as the transcendent nature of these great literary works. John Locke said that we have a great science of matter and motion. We just don't have a science of the mind. Now, he's writing this centuries ago, and he's absolutely right. Like you and I, our profession now, people come to us and we say, well, we're going to block this neurotransmitter and that neurotransmitter, and I'll have residents come to me and say, okay, patient's been depressed, they've been on Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, Celexa, Brintellix, and they won't tell me, they'll tell me this beautiful neuropsych presentation, but never tell me why the person is depressed, Yeah. So the reality is... Yeah, I mean, so and the sad thing is our profession has become so organic and so neurochemical and so receptor-based that we've forgotten about the mind. And I'm old enough to have been trained by really good, psychotherapists. And I think that our minds argue for the transcendent nature of our being. I tell people that, we're just talking about the hardware. It's like turning on the radio and you hear Mozart. Well, the Mozart's not coming from the radio. That's coming from somewhere else. The radio is just the tool, and the brain is just the tool of that which is transcendent. And so all we're talking about the brushes Caravaggio used. We're not talking about the Caravaggio, the painting itself. We're just talking about what was his pigment, what were his brushes. And so once you realize that, it's very, very humbling. But you also realize that in the latter works of Hemingway, so here he is, as a man who's losing his cognitive ability to convey this, but you see the beauty of these works just trying to, come through. If you look at the posthumous works like the Garden of Eden or the Africa Journal or Islands in the Stream, you see the same archetypes kind of coming through, but even to some extent in Movable Feast, the technical skill was lacking because the tool with which it was being conveyed, is being broken. And I spent a lot of time in the book talking about Willem de Kooning, because de Kooning is this amazing abstract expressionist, and he's similar to Hemingway in the superficial way that you see these sort of cartoony women, or you see something cartoony on the surface of his paintings, but below it is this layering and layering of beauty and complexity. And just like Hemingway, okay, a man catches a fish, or a man blows up a bridge, or soldiers march down the field, or whatever. That's the superficial story, but behind it is the layering and complexity. Hemingway himself said there were the three shots. He says, yeah, there's the superficial, there's the next layer, what's not being said, and there's the mythological illusion. And now it's very common now to understand Hemingway like we understand Joyce, someone who is bringing in mythological and religious references and allusions that are just not obvious. That Hemingway is, Joyce is the only person. Well, first of all, Hemingway and Joyce were friends, and Joyce read Hemingway manuscripts. It's the only person he did that for, and they basically are writing about the same thing. There was a Hemingway critic who stood up about 30 years ago and said, if you look at Farewell to Arms, you look at Ulysses, you have the male leaving the Martello Tower. You have the man leaving, the company of men. He seeks the surrogate father, Bloom and Daedalus versus Rinaldi and the priest and so forth, and Frederick Henry. Then you have him seeking the woman. You know that with Bloom, he can't be intimate with Molly because of the death of their son. We know that Frederick Henry's son dies at childbirth and his wife dies. He said, this is the same story. Ulysses and Farewell to Arms are the same. It's the same archetype. And people literally laughed at him, and yet he's absolutely right that Hemingway is a student of Joyce and has the identical. And later on, we see these mythological. And I think that, the beautiful thing about that is it may not be conscious. I think that, when you read, Stuart Gilbert's work on, Ulysses, where he directly talks to James Joyce and says, is this the illusion you were referring to? He never wants to say, was it conscious or unconscious? I think it can be unconscious. But I think that's the importance of the CTE, the dementia that Hemingway suffered, was that he tried very hard. I think the mythological underpinnings were there, just like an abstract expressionist. Whatever impulse is driving them, they're trying to do the same creative work, but they just can't. The technique, the ability to convey is gone with the dementing brain in Hemingway's case. Whereas in de Kooning's case, who had severe vascular dementia, well, he could simply, he could paint, and he used primary colors, and he did some nice works. But so his impulse was not as conscious as Hemingway. It didn't require the cognitive processing. It was a subconscious impulse that he can convey through basal ganglia and learn memory. He could convey those archetypes, whereas Hemingway couldn't.
Well, one of the things that both of us like, this is so darn interesting. I'm looking forward to talking to you about major depressive disorder, too, because you're really adding such an interesting dimension to the conversation. But I wonder this question. This is going to be something, the whole thing with Core Brain Journal is to get away from speculation, okay? I think we're speculating, and one of the reasons we speculate so often in psychiatry is because the whole standard of care is based on reductionistic thinking, and that's the end point. That's not where we start. That's where we're going. I mean, that's our mission, to find out that diagnosis. I mean, is it hyperactive or inattentive, And it's just so completely dumbs down the human experience. I mean, who wants to see a psychiatrist if they're going to be dumbed down,
Right. It's cookie cutter, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big cookie cutter world. And we're the global thought leaders on cookie cutter thinking.
Unfortunately, you're right. Yeah.
That's why I so appreciate this conversation. But now let me ask you a speculative point, because one of the things that occurred to me, and I've thought about this a lot, because I was thinking, what would have happened to Hemingway if? And I'm put your psychiatric hat on here for a little bit, and it's speculation, but we're just reviewing this a little bit. What would happen if he didn't have my recollection was it was about 25 shock treatments at Mayo. Was that it? Do you remember?
Correct, yeah. That's about right. Between two admissions, yes.
Yeah. So what would have happened to Hemingway if he didn't have that amount of shock therapy? I wonder what would have happened, because honestly, I've got this secret wish to go in and correct him. I had this thing, okay, now I've worked in addiction medicine for many years. I was certified in addiction medicine, so I kind of have that piece together. Psychopharmacology. I'm really kind of also asking on a personal level, what would you have done? I asked myself the question, what would I have done if I had a chance out there in Ketchum? And I told you before offline, I've been to his grave. We've been out in Ketchum and in Sun Valley and see that whole experience and the wonderful writing that he had on an obituary on a rock out there to a friend who passed away. But anyway, back to it. So what would you have done differently? What would you have done to try to turn Hemingway around if you had a shot at him?
That's a great question. Certainly, so you have a gentleman who comes to you with people have asked me, is he an alcoholic? Well, fine. He was a functional alcoholic, and he's the alcoholic in the spirit of Churchill, who said, I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me, right? And he famously said, a life without alcohol is like driving a race car without motor oil. And he also said famously that it's hard to take bores without alcohol. Life is boring without alcohol. It's hard to take bores without alcohol, so forth. So it was part of the persona, part of the image. I think he's one of those guys. I've met people, you met people, we just know, that you can't detox them. You detox them, they're going to go back to do something. And I remember I had an attending in residency who had a patient come in every 6 months for his Valium. He said, if I give this guy Valium, he doesn't drink, and it saves his liver. And so I give him 20 of Valium a day, and he doesn't do alcohol. And I thought, well, okay, that's the rare case. So someone like Hemingway, when he was told he had to take 2 glasses of wine a day, he could cut down. So I think we would subtract one of the offending agents. We'd say, okay, here's diazepam, or here's a couple glasses of wine a day, and that's your limit. Now, exercise, moderate exercise, and then keeping the brain active, of course, the classical music through the night so that the brain waves are still going even though you're asleep. And, of course, they took away his reserpine, which was causing more depression. That was an antihypertensive known to deplete serotonin. He was also at times taking Seconal. We would take that away. We would take away the high dose. He took Ritalin, and sometimes not a bad idea. He took testosterone, not a bad idea. Again, nothing consistent. High doses of vitamin A and vitamin E, because he thought one would help his eyesight, the other would help libido. I would replace those with B vitamins, of course, which we'll talk about. So I think there would have been things to do, and I think he would have had a longer life. I don't think he would have ended in such a tragic end. But the funny thing about suicide for him, he believed, there's this wonderful, well, not wonderful, I guess a tragic story, where he's in his 40s, late 40s. He's writing to Mary about his grandfather Hall, who had Bright's disease, which I think was a form of kidney inflammation, probably kidney stones, or probably kidney infection back then, and very painful, and the man wanted to kill himself. And so he puts his pistol under the bed, and Hemingway's father, Clarence Edmonds Hemingway, took the bullets out so that the old man, the grandfather, the father of his wife, of his Clarence's wife, pulls the trigger and nothing happens. And Hemingway wrote that he thought it was a cruel trick. Now, Hemingway was just 5 years old, so he had no way of knowing, that this was a cruel trick. Right. But the point is, he believed himself to be the descendant of suicidal men on both sides of his family, and he predicted his suicide, even rehearsed his suicide. He would, for friends in Cuba, he would put his Man Liker shotgun on the floor and put his big toe in the trigger and put it in the roof of his mouth and go click, and he would grin. Now, why he needed to do that's a whole other hour of discussion, but he really believed that he was destined for this. So there's the genetics
in that regard. One thing that occurs to me while you're talking about it, and I wanted to express my appreciation for your sharing that piece of information about practicing, because this afternoon when I was reading in preparation for our conversation, that was the first time I read about that practicing in Cuba and putting the gun in and having a grin after he basically did what he finally did when the gun was loaded. And
right.
There's a whole thing. I don't know. The one thing I'm puzzled by is this, the business of transcendence and what you actually leave behind. The business of what's the document. Part of the document is the book and the narrative and the story. But then I wonder how much of his life was punctuated by that death in his mind, as a message or as a statement in some way about certain levels of futility and having no answers. I mean, it's kind of a legacy statement, for want of a better word. I'm not trying to make it a good remark. I'm just talking about what might have been going on in his mind, because it has a narrative quality to it.
Right. You nailed it. And I think that, here's a gentleman who had the Nobel Prize, and he had wealth, and he had fame, and he had younger girlfriends at times, even throughout his marriage and so forth, marriages. So, why would he do this? And I think you're right. It's more of the statement and the more of, like he wrote in Our Time about how, the phrase of how they won't give you more than you can handle, of course being God, won't give you more than you can handle, meaning that you would just pass out or something. So something he reflected on his whole life. Now, he always equated the inability to work with, if he felt he couldn't write, he didn't want to live. He actually made that statement, and that was sort of his business to Fitzgerald was, Zelda's so crazy she puts you out of business. And I think that the ECT itself propelled that dementia. It accentuated the short-term memory deficits. It accentuated and propelled them to a level of poor recovery or non-recovery. And he felt at that point that his memory was erased and that he had nothing to work with. Yeah. In fact, the last piece of professional writing he ever did is classic Hemingway. He said, this book, he's talking about Movable Feast, comes with the remise of my memory and my heart, one of which has been tampered with, the other doesn't exist. Well, you can read it both ways. The memory doesn't exist, the heart's been tampered with, or the heart doesn't exist, the memory's been tampered with. But either way, he felt he could not go forward and produce, and that was always what would, mean that he was a useless human being. So you once again pulled that out, and sadly, you're right. If you think about his life without the suicide, I mean, he just is kind of, one of those iconic figures that just fits with the picture. Sad to say, just kind of fits with the picture. And I write in the introduction that, what are the most famous suicides in American history? Marilyn Monroe, Robin Williams, and Hemingway.
Really?
And those are the three. Yeah, those are the three that just come to mind if you think about suicides in our culture.
And you think of the deep interpersonal, within themselves, pain that they were feeling because of their limitations in terms of who they had become but couldn't continue to evolve further from in some way. I mean, they were stuck in it. They were in a very, very stuck. I was out there visiting in California. My son and daughter-in-law and their family took my wife and I. We went up to Mammoth and for the last kind of the ski and the snow. And I didn't ski myself, but my son took his last run down Mammoth. But we had a great time up there as a family.
Yes.
But the runoff left the roads odd. When you're in Owens Valley outside of Mammoth, the surface of the road looks very hard, but if you go off the road, it's only about 3 or 4 inches thick, and it's all muck beneath there. So you take a big Ram with a camper on back, and you go off there, you're in the mud, and you're really, really stuck. And I think when you get stuck like that, and you really don't have recourse, because writing would have been a recourse, for Marilyn, for Robin, for the creative people, their creativity would be a way to carry on and have some other level of expression, self-expression, self-understanding. And
you're right.
So they were just lost, and then we actually had a truck come out. This is a little too much information for this interesting conversation.
No, it's good.
We had a truck come out from Bishop, which pulled tanks out of ditches. It was an army truck and pulled us out. But we had the truck, thank goodness. We didn't have to live out there in the camper. And I think, metaphorically speaking, that they were in a serious rut that they saw no way to get out of, and that's really too bad, because somehow we as professionals need to figure out ways to provide those options and continue to think about ways that we could walk that extra mile with that person. And I think we need to have a specific awareness of celebrity stuckness, because when you reach a certain level, I was going to use the word grandiosity, but I think that's unfair. But a certain level of collaborative self-realization, where you're with a number of people in a certain other place than you were originally. And how do you maintain that collaborative, entertaining self-realization process? How can you get past that, and the celebrity is part of the problem.
Oh, you nailed it. I've only had a few celebrity patients, and one of them was a movie producer that actually took me for a ride in his Ferrari. Now, you talk about being seduced and losing your clinical judgment. I've never been in a Ferrari before, and, here's this famous guy, So you're absolutely right, and you nailed it, both with, Williams and Monroe. I mean, clearly these are people who are sort of trapped in the persona and expected to act a certain way, and that what kind of toll does that take on you? And people always say, well, Robin Williams was bipolar. Well, I think that was the shtick because, he was hypomanic to manic on stage, but when he was doing his role, he was perfectly contained and the most controlled actor you ever saw. And so you're absolutely right. It's funny, as you were saying those beautiful words, I have a buddy of mine, John Bream. He's a poet, and in his book, Help Is on the Way, there's a couple of lines that in one of his poems, it's only 6 lines, it says, to wrap yourself in the perceptions of others and then to enact the emptiness of those perceptions. Even a master illusionist is sometimes taken in by reality, dragged off stage in the mouth of the tiger. And so that's to me is Hemingway. To wrap yourself in the perception of others. Sometimes reality will just take over. It's a beautiful couple. It's a long poem, but those are the most beautiful lines of it. And you think about, what my argument with Hemingway is the persona, even if he wanted to break out of it, this CTE, the form of dementia he had, literally just trapped the worst aspects of that persona. I think for Williams, the information that he might have had Lewy body dementia again trapping the organicity, and of course Monroe. I think she, poor thing. I mean, she was just a victim of the media. So again, I think you nailed it with the whole idea, the persona becoming the person, and in some of these examples, the organicity kind of solidified it. Weren't those lovely lines? He's just such a good.
I was so taken with it. It's like, oh my gosh, we've got to wind up this conversation. What a great way! What a great way to close. I'm going to get that reference actually when I listen to when I prepare the show notes. I'm going to listen to that again and put it in the show notes and put the reference in there. It's just so fantastic.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I can't tell you, Andy, how much I've enjoyed this conversation. It's just one of the reasons to have this opportunity to speak to guests is to really have the opportunity to be introduced to really wonderful people like yourself. And I can't tell you how much I know that our audience is going to have a great time with this. And I know that your book is going to be phenomenally successful because you not only wrote it very well, but you speak about it so eloquently and so interestingly when you put Hemingway in perspective of the times, the place, the society, and the way we were years ago when he did pass away. So.
Oh, you're so kind. Well, no, I thank you for your work, bringing these things to light. And like I say, you've got so many wonderful podcasts and so much for your listeners to choose from. This is just fantastic. So thank you.
Well, I look forward to our next conversation, Andy. We'll talk about something more conventional, homocysteine.
Right, absolutely.
And we get right down to the biologic basis of something else we could have done if we could have just done a blood draw on Hemingway.
Exactly. I could have fixed him today, but just a couple of generations too late.
Yeah, right. Doggone it. All right, Andy, we'll sign off. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it. Look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks for listening to Core Brain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.